What happens when the one person who could always read him suddenly stops trying? Not because she stopped caring, not because she found someone else, but because one day she looked at him and realized she couldn't keep carrying the emotional weight for two people. At first, he barely noticed. Life looked normal from the outside. The texts became shorter. The conversations became safer. There were fewer questions, fewer difficult moments, less pressure. It almost felt easier, until he slowly discovered something most people never see coming. When someone stops reading your emotional world, they don't just stop understanding you. They stop making it possible for you to avoid understanding yourself. And that's when the silence starts changing shape. I don't think he noticed it the day it happened. That's probably the strangest part. People imagine these moments as dramatic. A final conversation, a slammed door, someone crying in the rain, some sentence that changes everything. But it wasn't like that. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. She asked him how work was. He said, "Fine." She smiled. "Long day?" "Yeah." And for the first time in a very long time, she didn't ask what was hiding behind the word fine. She just nodded. Okay. Then she changed the subject. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. He barely registered it. But something invisible ended right there. She used to hear things he never actually said. He could walk into the room carrying groceries, barely speak to sentences, and she'd somehow know he'd had a terrible day. "You don't have to tell me now," she'd say while putting vegetables away. "But somebody made you question yourself today." He'd stare at her. "What? You keep rubbing the back of your neck." "I always do that." "No." She'd smile. "You only do that when you're trying not to be angry." He used to laugh it off. "You think too much." Maybe she did. Or maybe she was simply paying attention in ways he'd quietly become dependent on. That's the uncomfortable truth. He thought she was naturally good at understanding him. He never stopped to wonder how much work it actually took. Looking back, she wasn't reading his energy. She was reading patterns. Tiny ones. The way he closed the car door harder than usual. The extra 5 seconds before answering a question. The fake yawn when he didn't want to talk. The joke that arrived half a second too quickly. The silence that was just a little too neat. Most people never notice those things. She did. Every single time. And after a while, he stopped noticing that she noticed. Which is what people do when someone loves them consistently. Consistency becomes invisible. There was this one memory. It's so painfully ordinary that I almost didn't include it. They were grocery shopping. Nothing romantic. Nothing cinematic. She was comparing to brands of pasta sauce while he wandered into another aisle. When she found him a few minutes later, he was staring at a shelf without actually looking at anything. Just standing there. People walked around him. Someone reached over his shoulder for cereal. He never moved. She didn't ask, "What are you thinking?" She simply touched his elbow. Softly. "You disappeared." He blinked. "What? You left?" "No. I'm right here." She smiled. "I know. But you left for a minute." He laughed, shook his head, picked up the wrong item, and they kept shopping. At the time, he thought she'd made something out of nothing. Years later, that memory wouldn't leave him alone. Because she had been right. His body had been standing in L7. Everything else had gone somewhere darker. She saw it before he did. That's what people don't always understand. Being emotionally seen isn't loud. It's almost boring. It's remembering someone doesn't like talking immediately after work. It's knowing they're quieter on Sunday evenings. It's noticing that their "I'm tired" sounds different depending on whether they're physically exhausted or emotionally overwhelmed. It's knowing the difference between silence that feels peaceful and silence that feels like someone disappearing inside themselves. None of those moments make good movies. but they're usually where love actually lives. At some point, he started assuming she'd always translate him. He didn't have to explain. She'd figure it out. He didn't have to admit he was anxious. She already knew. He didn't have to say he felt inadequate. She'd somehow bring it up gently 3 days later. He didn't have to tell her he was overwhelmed. She'd make dinner quieter. He thought this meant they understood each other deeply. Maybe they did, but only one of them was doing most of the translating. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Sometimes she asked questions, not because she didn't know, but because she wanted him to know. Are you okay? I'm fine. You sure? Yeah. Long pause. You don't sound convinced. I said I'm fine. Another pause. Then she'd let it go. Not because she believed him, because she realized he wasn't ready to hear himself. Those conversations happened more often than he remembers. Or maybe, more often than he wants to remember. There's this strange thing some men do. I know because I've done it. Someone asks how you're doing. You answer automatically. Good. Before your brain even checks if it's true. It's almost muscle memory. Like reaching for your seatbelt. Then, hours later, you're sitting alone in your car wondering why your chest feels tight. You never actually answered the question. You answered the socially acceptable version of yourself. She used to interrupt that autopilot. Not aggressively. Just enough. You answered really fast. So maybe answer again. He'd roll his eyes. I'm good. You still answer too fast. He'd laugh. You interrogating me now? No. A tiny smile. I'm waiting. Sometimes, after 30 seconds, he'd finally sigh. Actually, today kind of sucked. And somehow those became their best conversations. Not because she forced them, because she waited longer than everyone else did. Eventually, she got tired. Not angry. Not resentful. Just tired. There's a difference. People imagine emotional exhaustion looking dramatic. Usually it looks like someone asking fewer follow-up questions. Someone accepting shorter answers. Someone deciding, if he wants me to know, he'll tell me. She didn't make that decision overnight. She arrived there one unanswered conversation at a time. He mistook that change for comfort. Things felt easier. Fewer difficult conversations. Less emotional tension. No more feeling cornered by questions he couldn't answer. He even thought, maybe we're finally in a better place. Funny how often peace and emotional distance wear the same clothes. There was another small moment. One night they were watching television. He wasn't watching. He was scrolling. Reading the same email 3 times. His leg wouldn't stop bouncing. She noticed. Of course she noticed. She always noticed. Usually she'd reach over, rest her hand on his knee. What happened? That night, she looked once, looked back at the television, and said nothing. He kept scrolling. His leg kept bouncing. Some strange part of him kept waiting. For the hand. For the question. For someone to interrupt whatever storm was happening inside him. Nothing came. The silence felt different. Not cold. Not punishing. Just absent. It bothered him far more than he admitted. Not enough to say anything. Just enough to glance at her twice before looking back at his phone. She's quieter lately. He thought it, then immediately defended her in his own mind. No. She's just tired. Another voice answered. Or maybe she stopped trying. No. Then why does she ask less? I don't know. You don't want to know. He turned the television up louder. The conversation inside him disappeared. Or at least, he pretended it did. Looking back now, I don't think she stopped seeing him. That's too simple. She stopped volunteering to do all the emotional work by herself. Those are different things. She still noticed. She still saw the restless foot. The delayed replies, the heavier sighs, the smile that never quite reached his eyes. She just stopped translating them into conversations he wasn't willing to have. And something unexpected happened. Without her constantly reading beneath his words, he discovered he couldn't read himself very well either. That realization didn't arrive all at once. It came slowly, quietly, almost embarrassingly, because the person he thought understood him better than anyone had never been performing magic. She had simply been paying attention. Longer, closer, with more patience than most people ever will. And the day she stopped looking beneath his words was the day he unknowingly lost the mirror he'd been leaning on the entire time. For a while, he actually thought things were getting better. That's the part almost nobody talks about. People assume that when emotional distance begins, you immediately feel panic. You notice something is wrong. You fight for the relationship. Sometimes that happens. But sometimes, distance feels like relief before it feels like loss. Especially for someone who has spent years quietly avoiding difficult emotions. The questions became fewer. The pauses became shorter. Dinner became easier. There were no conversations that started with, "Can I ask you something?" No moments where she gently looked at him and somehow saw right through the version of himself he was trying to present. There were fewer tears, less tension, less uncertainty. And if you had asked him back then, he probably would have said, "I think we finally figured things out." He honestly believed that. Not because he was lying. Because his body confused the absence of emotional challenge with the presence of emotional safety. Those aren't the same thing. He just didn't know it yet. He came home from work one evening and noticed something strange. She didn't ask about his day. Not really. She smiled, asked if he wanted chicken or pasta, mentioned something funny that happened with a coworker. They watched television, folded laundry together, went to bed. It was pleasant. Nothing bad happened. Nothing good happened either. Just pleasant. He remembered lying there that night thinking, "This feels normal." He even slept better. Or at least he thought he did. There's something almost seductive about emotional predictability. Especially if you've spent your whole life believing difficult conversations always lead to conflict. If every uncomfortable feeling reminds you of childhood arguments, or parents you shut down, or relationships where honesty always turned into criticism, then silence can feel incredibly safe. Your nervous system mistakes it for protection. Not because silence is healthy, because silence is familiar. He didn't realize he had slowly started measuring the health of the relationship by one question. Did we argue today? If the answer was no, he assumed everything must be fine. He never stopped to ask a different question. Did we actually know each other today? Those are very different questions. One Saturday morning she made coffee. She used to hand him the mug and sit beside him. Sometimes they'd barely speak. Sometimes one quiet question would somehow become a 2-hour conversation. That morning, she placed the coffee on the table. "Your coffee." "Thanks." She smiled, went back into the kitchen. He picked up his phone, read sports headlines, checked the weather, watched a few videos he wouldn't remember an hour later. Something felt off, not painful, just slightly hollow. He couldn't explain why, so he ignored it. People ignore unexplained feelings all the time, especially men who learn early that emotions without obvious causes should probably be dismissed. A week later, he found himself talking more at work than he did at home. Not about anything meaningful, just noise, jokes, deadlines, weekend plans. The weird thing was, he came home exhausted anyway. He kept telling himself work was stressful. Maybe it was, but part of the exhaustion came from something else. Nobody was asking him real questions anymore. And strangely, he missed resisting them. One night he caught himself rehearsing a story in his head during the drive home. Something embarrassing had happened at work. Normally, she would have been the first person he'd tell. Not because he loved talking about himself, because she somehow made embarrassing things feel smaller. She'd laugh, not at him, with him. Then she'd notice the part underneath. So, you're actually worried they think less of you? He'd deny it. Immediately. No. She'd raise an eyebrow. No. Maybe a little. Then somehow, without either of them trying, the conversation would drift toward things he'd never intended to say out loud. That drive home, he rehearsed the story, changed details, thought about how he'd tell it. He opened the front door. She was making dinner. He kissed her forehead, asked what smelled so good. Then, he never told the story. Not because he decided not to, because somehow, the moment passed, and she never asked. Later that night, lying in bed, he remembered. Oh, I forgot. No, not forgot. There simply wasn't a place for it anymore. The strange thing about emotional distance is that it rarely announces itself. It accumulates, like an opened mail. One envelope doesn't change your life. Neither do 10. But eventually, there's a stack sitting by the door that quietly represents everything you've been avoiding. Relationships can become like that. Not exploding, accumulating. He began spending more time in little distractions. Longer showers, more scrolling, random YouTube videos, cleaning the garage for no particular reason, reorganizing drawers that didn't need reorganizing. At the time, he would have told you he was just staying busy. Maybe he believed that. But looking back, busyness became the perfect place to hide from feelings that hadn't yet learned how to introduce themselves. There was this oddly specific habit he developed. Every evening, he'd unlock his phone, open 3 different apps, close them, lock the phone. 5 minutes later, do it again. Nothing had changed. No messages, no notifications, nothing urgent. His thumb just kept reaching for the screen before his mind caught up, almost like his body was waiting for something. Attention, connection, interruption, anything. He didn't realize that habit had started around the same time she stopped asking what he was thinking. Everything's okay, he said it once while brushing his teeth. She looked at him through the mirror. I didn't say it wasn't. I know. So why did you say that? He shrugged. I don't know. She nodded. Neither of them spoke again. Later, that conversation replayed in his head. Not because of what she said, because of what she didn't. Months earlier, she would have asked, what makes you think something isn't okay? No. She simply accepted the answer he hadn't even been asked to give. That should have frightened him. Instead, he felt oddly relieved. Until much later. Sometimes relief is just delayed grief wearing comfortable clothes. Here's something I wish more people admitted. Sometimes he liked that she had stopped trying. At least part of him did. That sounds cruel. Maybe it is. But it's honest. He no longer felt guilty for disappointing her expectations. No longer worried about being asked questions he didn't know how to answer. No longer had to explain moods he barely understood himself. It was easier, emotionally cheaper, less demanding. He mistook that emotional discount for freedom. Then something unexpected happened. Without all those conversations, he started feeling strangely invisible. Not abandoned, invisible. There's a difference. Abandonment feels like someone leaves. Invisibility feels like someone stays, but no longer looks closely. It's much quieter, sometimes harder to notice. One afternoon she was reading on the couch. He sat beside her. Neither of them spoke. 10 minutes passed. 20. 30. Objectively, it was a peaceful afternoon. Yet he couldn't relax. He shifted positions, cleared his throat, checked his phone, went to get water he didn't actually want, came back, sat down again. She looked up briefly. "You okay?" "I'm fine." "Okay." Back to her book. He waited for another question. None came. And something inside him, something small, almost childlike, felt disappointed. Not because she had done anything wrong, because he suddenly realized how much he'd depended on her curiosity. Without it, he didn't know how to begin talking. There was a conversation happening inside him that never reached his mouth. Say something. Like what? "I don't know." Tell her you've had a weird day. It's not a big deal. So, she didn't ask. She doesn't have to. Long pause. "I know." But he stayed quiet anyway. That's another uncomfortable truth. Sometimes people think they're waiting for permission to be vulnerable. Often, they're waiting for someone else to do the emotional work of opening the door. She used to open it. Every time. Now, she simply left it unlocked. He stood outside anyway. He noticed other tiny things. She laughed more with friends. She looked lighter after phone calls with her sister. She seemed less emotionally occupied. He couldn't quite explain why that bothered him. Shouldn't he be happy? Wasn't this what he wanted? Less emotional intensity? More independence? Why did watching her become emotionally self-sufficient make him feel replaceable? He hated admitting that thought, even to himself, especially to himself, because nothing about her behavior suggested she was leaving. She still kissed him goodbye, still remembered how he took his coffee, still asked if he'd eaten lunch, still folded his shirts exactly the way he liked. Love hadn't disappeared, but something had quietly shifted. She had stopped carrying the emotional conversation by herself, and for the first time, he was discovering that he didn't actually know how to keep one alive. Not because he didn't love her, because he'd grown so accustomed to responding, that he'd forgotten how to initiate. People often imagine emotional distance as to people walking away from each other. Sometimes it looks much stranger than that. Sometimes the people are still sitting on the same couch, still sharing meals, still saying goodnight, still living almost the exact same life, except one person has stopped reaching beneath the surface, and the other hasn't yet realized they were surviving on that reach all along. At first, that feels peaceful. Then the quiet starts lasting a little too long, and eventually, he begins to understand something he couldn't have understood before. Silence doesn't always mean there's nothing wrong. Sometimes, it means the person who used to translate your silence has finally grown tired of speaking both parts of the conversation. He didn't notice the silence all at once. It didn't arrive like heartbreak usually does. There wasn't a dramatic goodbye. No final argument. No one walking out with a suitcase. Instead, it followed him home one ordinary evening. He turned off the engine, sat in the driveway, and didn't get out of the car. Not because he was checking his phone. Not because he had another email to answer. He just stayed there. 1 minute, then another. The radio had already switched to commercials. The air conditioner had stopped. The car felt strangely warm. Still, he didn't move. Eventually he sighed, grabbed his keys, and whispered something he couldn't explain. "I should go inside." It sounded less like someone coming home, and more like someone reporting for duty. A few months earlier, he would have rushed inside, not because home was exciting every day, but because someone inside the house had a habit of noticing him. She'd hear the front door. "You made it." Sometimes she'd hug him. Sometimes she'd just smile. Sometimes she'd look at his face for 2 seconds and ask, "Long day?" He almost always answered, "It was fine." She almost never believed him. Now, she still smiled. She still kissed his cheek. She still asked whether he'd eaten lunch. But she wasn't searching his face anymore. Not in the same way. She wasn't trying to solve him before he'd even taken off his shoes. And suddenly, walking through the front door felt strangely ordinary. It should have felt easier. Instead, it felt flatter. He couldn't explain it, so he didn't try. That's another thing people rarely admit. Most emotional experiences don't arrive with neat labels. Nobody wakes up thinking, "I believe I'm experiencing emotional invisibility." You just notice weird things. You stare at the refrigerator longer than necessary. You open the pantry, close it, open it again 30 seconds later. Not because you're hungry, because your body is looking for something your mind hasn't named yet. He started lingering in grocery store parking lots, at red lights, in the shower, anywhere that delayed arriving somewhere else. He wasn't avoiding home. Not exactly. He just wasn't eager anymore. That realization scared him. Because home wasn't a hostel. Nobody was yelling. Nobody was criticizing him. Everything looked healthy. So why did he keep sitting in his car? One night he walked into the kitchen around midnight. Couldn't sleep. Opened the refrigerator. Stood there staring at leftovers. Cold light spilling across the floor. He wasn't hungry. He knew he wasn't hungry. Still, he stood there for almost a minute. Door open. Milk. Eggs. Half a pizza. Orange juice. Nothing looked appealing. He closed the refrigerator. Walked into the living room. Sat in the dark. The television stayed off. His phone stayed face down beside him. The house was completely silent. For the first time, the silence felt like it was sitting beside him. Not around him. Beside him. It's funny how the body notices loneliness before the mind does. His shoulders stayed tense for no obvious reason. He clenched his jaw while driving. He started waking up at 3:17 a.m. Almost every night. Never exactly frightened. Just awake. He'd check the clock. Roll over. Close his eyes. Then his mind would quietly replay conversations that didn't seem important at the time. "What do you want for dinner?" "Whatever." "You sure?" "Yeah." Such ordinary conversations. Why were they suddenly echoing inside him? He found himself listening more carefully to other people's laughter. Not intentionally. Just whenever he heard a couple laughing in the grocery store, or to co-workers joking outside the office. Something inside him paused. He wasn't jealous. That wasn't quite it. It felt more like remembering a language he used to speak fluently. One afternoon, someone at work laughed. For half a second, the sound reminded him of her. Not exactly. Just close enough. His head turned automatically. His stomach tightened before his brain caught up. Wrong person. Wrong laugh. Still, his body had already reacted. Funny how memory works. Sometimes it borrows strangers. He hated how often he reached for his phone. Not to text her. Just to check it. Unlock. Lock. Unlock again. Open messages. Nothing new. Close messages. Open email. Close email. Weather. Sports. Back to messages. It wasn't information he wanted. It was interruption. Some proof that something was happening somewhere. Because inside him, everything had become so unbearably quiet. There was one evening that stayed with him. She had fallen asleep early. The television was still on. Some cooking competition neither of them had really been watching. He muted it, sat there, looked toward the hallway, thought about waking her. Not for anything important. Just to talk. About what? He didn't know. He actually stood up, walked halfway down the hallway, stopped. What am I doing? He laughed at himself. Quietly, almost embarrassed. Turned around, went back to the couch. The next morning, he never mentioned it. There was a conversation, that happened entirely inside his own head. You wanted to wake her. Yeah. So why didn't you? She was sleeping. That's not the reason. What was the real reason? I didn't know what I'd say. You've never needed a perfect reason before. No. I guess she used to help me find the words. That thought landed harder than he expected. It's strange. He had spent years believing she asked too many questions. No. Nobody was asking enough. He started driving without music. At first it happened by accident. He forgot to press play. Then, he realized he'd been driving in complete silence for 25 minutes. Normally that would have bothered him. Instead, he left it. Street lights passed across the windshield. Cream. Yellow. Red. The hum of the tires became louder than his thoughts. Then, without warning, one memory surfaced. They had been driving this exact road months ago. She had rolled down the window. Cold air rushed into the car. You can smell rain. There isn't any rain. There will be. 10 minutes later, it poured. He smiled just remembering it. Then almost immediately, his smile disappeared. Not because the memory hurt, because he suddenly realized he couldn't remember the last new memory they'd made like that. Everything recently felt functional, efficient, safe, but nothing stayed with him anymore. Sometimes grief doesn't arrive because someone is gone. Sometimes it arrives because life stops leaving fingerprints on you. His apartment, their house, whatever place he called home, started feeling strangely organized. Too organized. The laundry got done. The dishes were clean. Bills were paid. Everything functioned. One Saturday morning, he vacuumed the entire living room, then cleaned the kitchen, then reorganized a drawer that hadn't been opened in months, then cleaned the bathroom mirror, then wiped the kitchen counter again. When he finished, he looked around. Everything looked perfect. He sat down and immediately felt worse, almost irritated. What was I expecting? He muttered. Cleaning hadn't solved anything. It had simply given restless hands somewhere to go. That's something the body does. When emotions don't have language, they often become movement. People suddenly repaint the bedroom, organize closets, wash the car twice, run 6 miles, bake bread, anything to create the feeling that something has changed, even when nothing important has. One afternoon she came into the room. You've been cleaning all day. He shrugged. Needed to get it done. She nodded. Looks nice. That was it. No. You seem anxious. No. What's really going on? Just, it looks nice. And somehow, those 3 words left him feeling lonelier than criticism ever could. He kept thinking, why doesn't she notice? Then another voice quietly answered. Maybe she noticed months ago. That thought sat with him for days. There were little moments he couldn't stop replaying. She laughed with a cashier. She texted a friend and smiled at the screen. She spent Saturday afternoon reading while music played softly in the background. She seemed peaceful, not euphoric, not pretending, just lighter. And he couldn't decide whether that comforted him or frightened him. Because if she could be peaceful without constantly trying to understand him, then what exactly had changed? Her or him? One evening he caught himself watching her from across the room. She was watering a plant near the window, completely unaware, sunlight hitting the side of her face. She looked present. He realized something uncomfortable. He had spent months assuming she was emotionally withdrawing. Maybe she wasn't withdrawing. Maybe she had simply stopped chasing someone who kept walking away every time things became emotionally real. Those are different stories. One makes you the victim. The other asks something of you. He looked away before she noticed. Not because he was hiding, because he suddenly felt exposed. as if she could somehow hear the sentence forming inside him. I miss you. Which made absolutely no sense. She was only 20 feet away. How do you miss someone who is still sitting in the same room? He would have laughed at that question once. No. It kept him awake. Late one night he almost said it. She was brushing her teeth. He stood beside her. Mirror fogged from the shower. He opened his mouth. I. She looked over. Yeah. He froze. Nothing. You sure? Yeah. She nodded. Finished brushing her teeth. Turned the bathroom light off. Went to bed. He stayed there another minute, looking at his own reflection. The mirror had started clearing. His face slowly came back into focus. He barely recognized the expression. Not sadness. Not anger. Something quieter. The look of someone realizing that silence had become a habit, long before it became a consequence. And perhaps the strangest part of all was that he could no longer tell whether the silence was coming from the room around him, or from somewhere much closer, a place inside himself that had forgotten how to speak before someone else invited it to. The strange thing about memory is that it almost never returns in chronological order. It doesn't organize itself into neat chapters. It doesn't politely hand you the moments that should matter most. Instead, it chooses the smallest things. A look, a pause, the way someone reached across the table without thinking, the sentence you barely heard because you assumed there would always be another chance to hear it again. That's how it began for him. Not with the big memories, not with vacations, not with anniversaries, not with birthdays. It started with moments so ordinary they had seemed almost disposable while they were happening. One afternoon, while standing in line for coffee, he suddenly remembered something that had happened nearly a year earlier. They had been walking through a grocery store. He had stopped to compare two brands of cereal. Without looking at him, without interrupting what she was doing, she had quietly reached over and straightened the collar of his jacket. That was it. No conversation, no romance, no dramatic music, just one absent-minded gesture. He had barely noticed it. Back then, he probably didn't even say thank you. Now, standing in a completely different store, he remembered the exact feeling of her fingers brushing the back of his neck. How was that possible? Why that memory? Out of thousands? Because memory isn't always trying to remember events. Sometimes it's trying to remember how it felt to be cared for. And the body, the nervous system, remembers touch long after the mind forgets dates. He started noticing this happening more often. A song in the supermarket would remind him of a Tuesday afternoon. The smell of coffee would bring back a conversation in the kitchen. A blue sweater hanging in a department store would remind him of one she used to wear on cold mornings. None of these memories were extraordinary. That was exactly what made them impossible to escape. Because extraordinary moments are easy to admire, ordinary moments are where attachment quietly takes root. One evening he opened a kitchen drawer looking for scissors. Instead, he found an old grocery list. Milk, eggs, chicken, dish soap, bananas. Her handwriting, tiny, slightly slanted. Nothing sentimental, just a shopping list. He stared at it much longer than anyone should. Then he laughed at himself. It's a grocery list. He almost threw it away. Instead, he folded it once, put it back in the drawer, closed it carefully, as if paper could somehow become fragile after enough time. Months ago, he would have found that ridiculous. Now, he understood something uncomfortable. It wasn't the grocery list. It was proof that someone had quietly shared an ordinary life with him. And somehow, those ordinary pieces had become the hardest ones to lose. He remembered another moment, one that hadn't seemed meaningful at all. She used to text him one question around 3 in the afternoon. Have you eaten? Sometimes he'd answer. Sometimes he'd forget. Sometimes he'd simply send a thumbs up emoji. Never once did he think, one day I'll miss this. Because that's how familiarity works. It disguises itself as permanence. You assume tomorrow will look like today. Until one day, it doesn't. The question eventually stopped coming. Not dramatically. Not because they had argued. It just stopped. At first he appreciated it. Less interruption during work. One fewer notification. More space. Months later, he found himself checking his phone around 3 o'clock anyway. Almost instinctively. His body had learned to expect something his mind hadn't appreciated while it still existed. There are habits that belong to two people, even when only one of them knows their habits. One rainy Saturday, he was cleaning out his car. Under the passenger seat, he found the hair tie. Black, slightly stretched, worth almost nothing. He held it between two fingers, smiled, then immediately felt foolish. Why am I smiling at a hair tie? He almost threw it into the trash bag. Instead, he placed it in the center console. Not because he needed it, because somehow throwing it away felt heavier than keeping it. If you've ever lost someone emotionally, you probably understand this. Objects begin carrying emotions they were never designed to hold. Coffee mugs, receipts, movie tickets, hair ties, parking stubs, empty perfume bottles. They become witnesses, silent evidence that another life once existed alongside yours. He remembered a conversation that lasted less than 30 seconds. She had walked into the room carrying laundry. He was answering emails. Without looking up, he said, "Can you leave those there?" She replied, "Of course." That was all. At the time, he didn't even pause his typing. Now, months later, he wondered something that had never occurred to him before. How many times had she quietly adjusted herself around his moods? How many little accommodations had become invisible because she made them look effortless? He hated that question, because there was no way to count. Memory has an odd sense of justice. It often withholds understanding until understanding can no longer change the past. He remembered how she used to wait before starting movies. Not because she wanted snacks, because she knew he always forgot his phone charger. She'd say, "Go get it now." He'd roll his eyes. "I'm fine. You'll need it." "I won't." 20 minutes later, "I'll be right back." She'd smile. "I know." Back then, he thought she was teasing him. Now, he realized she had simply learned him. In hundreds of tiny ways. Ways he had never bothered to notice because they happened so naturally. One afternoon he caught himself doing something strange. He accidentally dropped a spoon while making coffee. The metallic sound echoed across the kitchen. His first instinct, before he even bent down, was to look toward the living room, as if expecting her to laugh. She always laughed. Not cruelly, just warmly. "You drop something every single day." "I do not." "You absolutely do." "I don't." "You dropped your keys yesterday." "That doesn't count." "It definitely counts." The conversation played in his head with astonishing clarity. He smiled, then looked toward the empty room. Nobody answered. He realized something then. Loneliness wasn't always the absence of people. Sometimes, it was the absence of predictable responses. The laugh you expected, the eyebrow raise, the sarcastic comment, the familiar, "I knew you'd say that." Those little exchanges build an invisible rhythm between two people. When they disappear, life keeps moving, but it no longer sounds the same. He began replaying entire days, not because they had been special, because he wanted to understand something. Was there a moment when she began pulling back? Did he miss it? Could he have noticed sooner? His mind searched like someone looking through old security camera footage, frame by frame. "There?" she asked twice instead of 3 times. "There?" She stopped reaching for his hand in the grocery store because both of her hands are full. Or because she had simply stopped expecting him to notice. He couldn't tell anymore. Memory isn't objective. It's emotional. Every replay slightly rewrites itself. Every regret adds a little more color. One night he found himself laughing alone. Not because something was funny. Because he remembered an argument they once had over absolutely nothing. Whether cereal belonged in the pantry or on the lower shelf. They had defended their positions with ridiculous seriousness. You can't see it down there. You don't need to see cereal. That's not the point. It kind of is. Eventually she had laughed first. Then he had. The argument lasted maybe 5 minutes. At the time, he thought it was meaningless. Now, he would have gladly argued about cereal for another hour. Not because of the cereal. Because ordinary disagreements belong to ordinary intimacy. And ordinary intimacy had become the thing he missed most. He also remembered the moments he had dismissed. The times she said, "You seem somewhere else." And he answered, "I'm just tired." The evenings she sat beside him in silence, waiting for him to speak. The mornings she asked, "Is everything okay between us?" And he responded too quickly, "Of course." Looking back, he realized those weren't accusations. They were invitations. She wasn't demanding perfection. She was offering connection. He had mistaken curiosity for pressure. And eventually, she stopped extending invitations that were rarely accepted. There was one memory he couldn't escape. It happened on an ordinary Sunday. She had walked into the room carrying the cups of coffee. She handed him one, then sat beside him without saying anything. After a minute she asked softly, "What are you thinking about?" He remembered answering almost automatically, "Nothing." She looked at him for a second. Not frustrated, not disappointed, just sad. Very gently she said, "You spend a lot of time thinking about nothing." Then she smiled to soften the sentence. At the time he laughed. Now, those words echoed differently. She hadn't believed he was thinking about nothing. She had believed he no longer trusted her with what was actually happening inside him. There was a difference. A painful one. Regret has a strange habit. It doesn't always replay the moments when someone hurt you. Sometimes, it replays the moments when someone tried to reach you, and you unknowingly stepped half an inch away. Not because you wanted distance, because you assumed there would always be another chance, another evening, another conversation, another ordinary Tuesday. As the memories continued to return, he slowly stopped asking himself, "Why can't I stop thinking about her?" Instead, the question became something far quieter. When did I stop seeing all the ways she loved me? And perhaps that was the hardest realization of all. The things haunting him weren't grand declarations of love. They weren't passionate kisses or unforgettable vacations. They were coffee cups placed beside him without being asked. Questions he answered too quickly. A jacket collar quietly straightened. A grocery list folded into a drawer. A laugh after dropping a spoon. Tiny moments that had seemed too ordinary to matter, until they became the only proof that love had once been speaking to him every single day, in a language so gentle. He hadn't realized he would miss it until it was no longer being spoken. It didn't happen all at once. He didn't wake up one morning and suddenly decide to fight for the relationship. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, he started doing little things. Tiny things. Almost invisible things. The kind of gestures that look like reaching from the outside. That never require true vulnerability. Because that was the only kind of reaching he knew how to do. He started sending her funny videos again. Nothing personal. Just little clips that made him laugh. A dog stealing someone's sandwich. A man attempting to build IKEA furniture without instructions. A child explaining dinosaurs with complete confidence and absolutely no facts. She reacted with a laughing emoji. Sometimes she'd reply, "That's cute." Sometimes. This is so you. The conversations ended there. He stared at the screen longer than necessary. Waiting. For what? He couldn't say. Maybe another message. Maybe a question. Maybe the version of her that used to take a 30-second joke and somehow turn it into a 30-minute conversation. But the screen stayed quiet. And somehow, he felt rejected by a conversation that had never actually begun. A week later, he brought home her favorite dessert. Not because there was a celebration, just because he happened to pass the bakery. He placed the small box on the kitchen counter. I saw these. Her face lit up. You remembered? Of course. She smiled. Thank you. She hugged him. A warm hug. A sincere one. Then she carried the dessert into the kitchen. That should have been enough. It was kind. It was thoughtful. It was appreciated. Yet, something inside him still felt strangely empty. Because what he had really wanted wasn't gratitude. It was recognition. He wanted her to somehow understand what he hadn't said. See? I'm trying. Can't you tell? But she couldn't respond to a sentence he never spoke. That was becoming the pattern. He kept communicating in symbols, hoping she'd translate them into emotions. She had spent years doing exactly that. Now, she no longer volunteered for the job. One evening he asked, "Want to watch a movie tonight?" She looked pleasantly surprised. Sure. They made popcorn, turned off the lights, sat together under the same blanket. Halfway through the movie, he realized he wasn't paying attention. Neither was she. They were both looking at the screen. But something invisible sat between them. Not anger, not resentment, just distance. Near the end of the film, he almost reached for her hand. His fingers moved a few inches, then stopped. He told himself, she probably wants to watch the movie. Maybe she's comfortable. Maybe I shouldn't interrupt. The truth was simpler. He wasn't afraid of interrupting the movie. He was afraid of what it would mean if she didn't take his hand. So he never gave her the chance. Sometimes people call that caution. Often, it's fear wearing better manners. He noticed another habit. Whenever she walked into the room, he suddenly became busy, checking emails, adjusting something on the television, looking through the refrigerator, straightening papers on the table. His body had learned something his mind hadn't admitted. Being emotionally available made him nervous. Doing tasks felt safer. Tasks have clear endings. Conversations don't. One Saturday afternoon, she was watering plants on the balcony. He walked outside. Beautiful weather. Quiet neighborhood. The kind of afternoon people later describe as peaceful. He leaned against the railing. So. Long pause. Nice weather. It is. Another pause. He looked out at the trees. She continued watering the plants. 5 minutes later, he walked back inside. Later that evening, he caught himself thinking, why is talking to her suddenly so hard? Then another thought arrived. It wasn't sudden. It had always been difficult. She had simply carried most of the conversation before. That realization unsettled him, because it forced him to ask a question he'd been avoiding. Had he ever really known how to initiate emotional closeness? Or had he only known how to respond when someone else created it? Those are not the same skill. Not even close. He remembered the early years. Back then everything seemed effortless. They talked until 2 in the morning. Shared stories from childhood. Laughed over nothing. Finished each other's sentences. He used to believe that happened because they were naturally compatible. Now, he wasn't so sure. Looking back, he realized something. She had asked hundreds of questions. What scared you as a kid? What's your favorite memory with your grandfather? What do you think happiness actually feels like? What do you miss most? What are you afraid people misunderstand about you? He had answered, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes awkwardly. But he answered. Over time, he began believing those conversations happened naturally. He forgot someone had been gently building them, brick by brick, question by question. Without those questions, he didn't know where to begin. One morning she left before him. On the kitchen table sat a small note. Don't forget your meeting. Good luck. Love you. He smiled, folded the note, placed it carefully into his wallet. All day he kept touching it, as though paper could somehow reassure him. When he came home, he wanted to tell her how much the note had meant. Instead he said, Meeting went well. That's great. She smiled. I'm happy for you. He nodded. Conversation over. Driving home, he had imagined saying, I carried your note with me all day. Standing in the kitchen, those words somehow disappeared. Why? Because appreciation feels surprisingly vulnerable. People think vulnerability only means crying. It doesn't. Sometimes saying, that small thing mattered to me, is infinitely harder. Because if someone knows what matters to you, they also know where you are soft. He started offering practical help more often. I'll take care of dinner. I'll clean the kitchen. I'll pick up groceries. I'll fix that shelf. She appreciated all of it. She genuinely did. But something still felt unfinished. Acts of service were replacing conversations. Productivity was replacing intimacy. He was solving logistical problems. She had never been asking for logistical solutions. She had been asking for emotional participation. One evening they folded laundry together. An ordinary task. Shirts, towels, socks. Silence filled the room. Not uncomfortable, just familiar. Halfway through folding a sweatshirt, he almost said, I miss us. The words reached his throat, paused there, then transformed. Instead he asked, do we need more detergent? She looked at him. I think we're okay. Okay. Back to folding. He hated himself a little in that moment. Not because he asked about detergent, because somewhere inside him, he knew detergent had become a substitute for honesty. The body is incredibly creative when it wants to avoid emotional exposure. It will suddenly remember errands, notice dirty windows, need another cup of coffee, think about tomorrow's schedule. Anything, except remain inside a difficult conversation long enough to tell the truth. A few days later they went for a walk after dinner. The sidewalks were almost empty. Children rode bicycles in the distance. Someone was grilling in a nearby backyard. The air smelled like summer. He thought, this is perfect. I'll tell her now. He rehearsed the sentence. I feel like we've been distant. Too dramatic. I've been thinking a lot lately. Too vague. I miss talking to you. Too embarrassing. By the time he found a version that felt safe, they were already back at the front door. Opportunity gone. Again. People often imagine avoidance as running away. Sometimes avoidance looks exactly like walking beside someone for 45 minutes. Without saying a one sentence you carried the entire time. She noticed something eventually. Not because he told her. Because human beings notice patterns. You've seemed distracted lately. His heart immediately started racing. This was it. The opening. The invitation. The exact thing he had secretly wanted. He could finally tell her. Instead, he smiled. I'm just tired. She nodded. Okay. And she believed him. Or perhaps, she simply accepted the answer because she was tired of trying to negotiate with closed doors. Later that night he lay awake replaying the conversation. Why didn't I tell her? He searched for an explanation. Fear? Maybe. Shame? Partly. Habit? Probably. Then one thought landed with surprising clarity. He had spent so many years protecting himself from rejection that he never realized silence guaranteed the very loneliness he feared. He wasn't protecting the relationship. He was protecting the version of himself that never had to risk being fully seen. And those are very different things. The next week, something unexpected happened. She laughed with a friend on the phone for nearly an hour. The sound floated through the hallway. Warm, easy, unforced. He smiled at first. Then, a strange sadness settled over him. She still had that laugh. It hadn't disappeared. She hadn't become emotionally unavailable. She hadn't stopped connecting. She had simply stopped working so hard to create connection, where it was no longer being met halfway. That realization hurt more than any argument could have, because arguments suggest to people are still fighting for something. Quiet acceptance suggests someone has grown tired. Late one evening, he stood outside their bedroom door. She was already asleep. The hallway was dark. His hand rested lightly on the doorknob. He thought about waking her. Not because there was an emergency. Not because anything terrible had happened. Just because he wanted to say one simple sentence. I don't know how to do this anymore. He imagined her opening her eyes, listening, taking his hand, maybe crying, maybe smiling, maybe simply saying, I know. Instead, he quietly opened the door, walked inside, slipped into bed without making a sound. She shifted slightly in her sleep. Without waking, she instinctively moved a little closer, resting her hand lightly against his arm. An unconscious gesture, a familiar one. He closed his eyes. The warmth of her hand was still there. The love, perhaps, was still there too. But for the first time, he understood something that had been true long before he was willing to admit it. Being physically close to someone is not the same as letting them emotionally reach you. For years, she had been standing outside the locked rooms inside him, knocking patiently, believing that one day he would open the door. Now, he was the one standing outside, hand raised, heart racing, finally understanding that wanting connection and knowing how to create it are two entirely different things. And perhaps the cruelest lesson of all is that by the time some people learn how to knock, the person on the other side has quietly stopped waiting for the sound. There was no dramatic revelation, no single conversation that suddenly explained everything, no shocking confession, no hidden messages, no secret betrayal. The truth arrived the way most important truths do, quietly, almost politely, as if it had been standing in front of him for years, waiting for him to stop looking everywhere else. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. She came home from work, set her keys on the kitchen counter, took off her shoes, fed the dog, changed into comfortable clothes, started dinner. He watched her from across the room. Not intentionally. His eyes simply stayed on her longer than usual. She moved through the kitchen with calm efficiency, cutting vegetables, checking the oven, washing a cutting board before she even finished using it. Nothing remarkable, nothing unusual. Then, for the first time, he noticed something he couldn't believe he had missed. She never stopped moving. While dinner cooked, she answered a message from her mother, remembered to order more laundry detergent, moved the wet clothes into the dryer, signed a permission slip for their niece, watered a plant that looked slightly dry, checked tomorrow's weather, refilled the coffee machine for the morning, all without making a single announcement, without asking for recognition, without calling attention to herself. She simply kept the rhythm of their shared life moving. He suddenly wondered something that had never occurred to him before. How many things does she remember? So I don't have two. That question stayed with him, because once he asked it, he couldn't stop seeing the answer. He noticed that she always knew when groceries were running low. She remembered birthdays. She knew which towels belonged in which closet. She knew when his parents' anniversary was. She knew which light bulbs needed replacing. She remembered to schedule appointments. She remembered the names of neighbors. She remembered how he liked his coffee after difficult days. She remembered stories he had forgotten telling. She remembered everything, not because she had extraordinary memory, because someone had to carry the invisible details of her everyday life. And somehow, he had mistaken that constant effort for something that happened automatically. There is a dangerous illusion inside long relationships. When someone consistently carries emotional and practical responsibility, their effort slowly becomes invisible, not because it becomes less valuable, because the human brain quickly adapts to consistency. We notice interruptions. We rarely notice reliability. He remembered all the times he had walked into a clean house, thinking, "The house is clean," instead of asking, "Who made sure it became clean?" He remembered opening the refrigerator, finding his favorite food, never wondering who noticed he was almost out of it. He remembered holidays that somehow came together every year. Family birthdays, weekend plans, doctor appointments, gifts, reservations, phone calls. He had experienced all of them. She had quietly coordinated most of them. It wasn't just physical work. It was mental work, the invisible kind, the kind nobody applauds because nobody sees it happening. Later that evening she asked, "Could you remind me to call the insurance company tomorrow?" He almost answered automatically. Then he stopped. Wait. She was asking him to remind her, to remember something, because she was already remembering 100 other things. That tiny sentence suddenly sounded completely different. He found himself looking back over years of ordinary life. He remembered coming home exhausted after work, complaining about meetings, stress, deadlines, traffic. She always listened, really listened, asked questions, remembered names, followed up days later. "So how did that presentation go? Did your manager ever respond? What happened with that client?" He realized something uncomfortable. He couldn't remember asking her the same kinds of follow-up questions nearly as often. Not because he didn't care, because somewhere along the way, he had unconsciously assumed she would simply tell him if something important happened. But emotional safety doesn't only come from being allowed to speak. It comes from knowing someone is curious enough to ask. One memory returned with painful clarity. She had once spent 20 minutes telling him about a difficult conversation with a coworker. At the time, he remembered offering solutions. "You should talk to your manager. Maybe just ignore it. It'll probably work itself out." Looking back, he couldn't remember asking a single question. Not one. "How did that make you feel? What bothered you the most? Are you okay? Did you feel alone?" Nothing. He had moved immediately into fixing, because fixing felt useful. Listening felt uncertain. Years later, he finally understood something. Most people don't share their emotional lives because they're searching for advice. They're searching for company. He wasn't emotionally absent because he lacked love. He was emotionally absent because he believed love was demonstrated through solving. She had often been asking for witnessing. Those are different gifts. The next few days became strangely revealing. Everywhere he looked, he found evidence. She noticed when he was unusually quiet. She remembered his favorite restaurant without checking. She bought his preferred toothpaste before he realized it was empty. She folded his sweatshirt the way he liked because the hood dried faster. She charged his headphones after borrowing them. She placed a glass of water beside the bed when he had a headache. None of these actions were extraordinary. Each one took less than a minute. But together, they formed something enormous. A life built from thousands of tiny acts of attention. Love rarely disappears all at once. More often, it exists inside ordinary habits that become so familiar. We stop recognizing them as love. One Friday evening they had dinner with friends. The conversation flowed easily. People laughed, shared stories, ordered dessert. Halfway through the meal, One of their friends said, "You two seem so comfortable together." Everyone smiled. He smiled too. But something inside him shifted. Comfortable. That was the perfect word. They looked comfortable. What nobody at the table could see was how much of that comfort had quietly depended on one person continuously tending to the emotional atmosphere. Like someone keeping a fire alive by adding small pieces of wood every day. No one notices the effort until the warmth begins to fade. Driving home, he glanced toward her. She looked out the window. Street lights passed across her face. He suddenly wondered, how many nights has she driven home feeling unseen? While sitting right beside me, the thought tightened his chest. Not because he knew the answer, because he suspected the answer was far too many. That weekend something happened that seemed insignificant. She couldn't find her keys. Normally, she always knew where they were. She searched the kitchen, the bedroom, the living room. He noticed the frustration on her face. "I swear I just had them." Without thinking, he said, "I'll help." They searched together. 5 minutes later, he found them inside a jacket pocket. She smiled with visible relief. "Thank you." Then something unusual happened. She sat down, closed her eyes, and sighed. Not dramatically, just deeply. The kind of sigh that comes from someone who has been mentally carrying too much for too long. He looked at her. Really looked. Noticed the tiredness around her eyes. The way she rubbed her forehead. The tiny pause before she stood back up. He realized this wasn't about the keys. It was about the 100 other invisible responsibilities already filling her mind. The keys were simply the first thing that overflowed. For years, he had interpreted her occasional forgetfulness as stress. Now he understood it differently. No mind can indefinitely carry every detail of two people's lives without becoming exhausted. That night he couldn't sleep. His thoughts wandered through years of memories. He remembered every time she said, "I'm tired." He had assumed she meant physically tired. Now he wondered, had she actually meant emotionally tired? Mentally tired? Tired of remembering? Tired of initiating? Tired of noticing everything? Tired of holding conversations together? Tired of asking questions that rarely came back? People often think burnout only happens at work. Relationships can produce burnout too, especially when one person quietly becomes the emotional organizer for two lives. The next morning he woke up before she did, made coffee, prepared breakfast. Nothing elaborate, just enough so she wouldn't have to think about it. When she walked into the kitchen, she smiled. "This is nice." He nodded. It wasn't much. She looked at him. "It doesn't have to be much." That sentence stayed with him all day. Because she wasn't talking about breakfast anymore. Maybe she never had been. Maybe that had always been the point. Love had never required grand gestures. It had required consistent attention. Attention. Not perfection. Not expensive gifts. Not perfect communication. Attention. The willingness to notice another person's inner world before they have to announce it. Late that afternoon he sat alone on the back porch. The yard was quiet. A light breeze moved through the trees. He found himself asking a question he had never seriously considered before. What if she wasn't asking me to become someone completely different? What if she had only been asking me to become more present? Not louder. Not more romantic. Not more successful. Simply more available. More curious. More willing to pause before solving. More willing to ask one extra question. More willing to stay in uncomfortable conversations instead of escaping into practical tasks. For the first time, the problem no longer felt impossible. It also felt impossible to ignore. Because awareness creates responsibility. Once you finally see what someone has been carrying, you cannot honestly pretend the weight was never there. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the rooftops, One final realization settled quietly inside him. The greatest mistake he had made was never failing to love her. He had loved her in all the ways he understood. He worked hard. He stayed loyal. He tried to provide. He solved problems. He remained dependable. But somewhere between responsibility and routine, he had forgotten. Every human heart quietly asks one question long before it asks for anything else. Do you notice me? Not my achievements. Not my responsibilities. Not what I do for you. Me. The person carrying all of it. And perhaps that was the most heartbreaking truth of all. Because by the time he finally learned to see the invisible weight she had been carrying every day, she had already become so accustomed to carrying it alone that she no longer expected anyone to reach over and help. People often imagine that change happens like a lightning strike. One conversation, one apology, one tearful night, one breakthrough, and suddenly, everything is different. But real change rarely arrives with that kind of drama. Real change is slower, quieter. It begins beneath the surface, long before anyone else notices. And that is exactly why two people can be living in the same house, while changing in completely opposite directions. He thought he was finally waking up. In many ways, he was. He had started noticing, listening, asking more questions, pausing before offering solutions, looking into her eyes instead of simply hearing her words. He believed, for the first time in years, that he was becoming the partner she had always needed. The heartbreaking part was that she had begun becoming someone else months before. Not someone colder, not someone cruel, simply someone who had learned to survive without expecting emotional rescue. It showed up in little ways. One evening she came home looking unusually tired. Before, she would have sat beside him, rested her head on his shoulder, told him about her day in scattered pieces. Now, she quietly changed clothes, made herself a cup of tea, sat alone on the back porch, not because she wanted distance, because somewhere along the way, solitude had become more predictable than disappointment. He watched her through the kitchen window. She looked peaceful, not happy, not sad, just comfortable in her own company. Months earlier, that image might not have meant much. Now, it unsettled him, because he realized something. She no longer looked like someone waiting. There is a subtle difference between loneliness and no longer expecting to be emotionally found. One hurts, the other transforms you. He remembered something she once said years ago. I actually like being alone. At the time he laughed. Everyone says that. She smiled. No, I really do. He hadn't understood her then. He assumed being alone was simply something people tolerated until connection returned. He never imagined someone could slowly build an entire emotional home inside themselves. Now, he watched her reading a book on the porch, completely absorbed. No phone, no television, no need to fill silence. She wasn't performing independence. She had practiced it, day after day, conversation after conversation, disappointment after disappointment. Tiny moments had taught her that waiting for someone else's emotional availability was exhausting. So, without bitterness, she had quietly learned to become emotionally available to herself. People often mistake this transformation for emotional detachment. Sometimes it isn't detachment at all. Sometimes it's emotional relocation. The place where someone once searched for comfort has simply changed. One Saturday morning he woke up early. She was already gone. For a moment panic rose inside him. Then he noticed a note. Went to the farmer's market. Back around 11. Simple. Ordinary. He smiled. Then something else occurred to him. Months ago, she would have asked, "Do you want to come?" Now, she simply went. Not because she didn't love him, because she had stopped organizing her happiness around his participation. He found that realization strangely difficult. He had always believed independence was attractive, until he realized what it often costs someone to build it. Later that day, she returned carrying fresh flowers, bread, fruit, a small bag of coffee beans. She looked genuinely content. He asked, "Did you have fun?" "I did." "What did you do?" "Oh, I walked around, talked to one of the farmers about tomatoes, sat with coffee for a while, read a little." She smiled as she unpacked everything. He listened carefully. There was no hidden resentment, no passive aggression, no attempt to make him feel guilty. She wasn't trying to prove she didn't need him. She had simply created a life that continued moving, whether he joined it or not. That realization echoed through him for days, because somewhere inside, he had unconsciously believed there would always be time. Time to become more attentive. Time to become emotionally open. Time to finally say everything he had struggled to say. He assumed love patiently waited forever. Now, he wondered whether love waits, or whether people simply become stronger while waiting. Strength changes people, not always in obvious ways. Sometimes strength looks like lower expectations. Sometimes it looks like fewer questions. Sometimes it sounds like, "It's okay," when something isn't actually okay anymore. He noticed she apologized less, not because she became selfish, because she stopped taking responsibility for emotions that weren't hers. He noticed she explained herself less. She no longer repeated the same concern 3 different ways hoping to finally be understood. She would say something once, maybe twice. Then, she trusted him to either hear it or not. That wasn't withdrawal. That was acceptance. One evening they met friends for dinner. Someone asked, "So, what have you been up to lately?" She answered first, "I started taking a ceramics class." He looked at her. "You did?" She smiled. 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. He hadn't known. Not because she was hiding it, because he had never asked what she had started dreaming about. His questions had always revolved around schedules, responsibilities, plans. Never, "What are you becoming lately?" That question lingered long after dinner ended, because people are always becoming someone, even inside long relationships, especially inside them. The tragedy is that we often continue loving an old version of someone, while quietly failing to meet the person standing in front of us today. Driving home, she talked enthusiastically about pottery, about learning patience, about creating something imperfect with her hands, about accidentally ruining 3 bowls before making one she actually liked. He listened, really listened. Then he realized her voice sounded different, lighter, not because life had become easier, because she had found somewhere to place parts of herself that had gone unseen for years. He wasn't jealous of pottery. He was grieving the fact that she had found emotional nourishment somewhere he once could have offered. Psychologists sometimes talk about emotional adaptation, the remarkable ability humans possess to reorganize themselves around prolonged disappointment. At first, we protest. Then, we negotiate. Eventually, we adapt. The adaptation doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes, it simply looks like someone laughing a little more with friends and with their partner, talking more openly with strangers, developing hobbies, finding peace in routines, sleeping more easily alone. Not because connection no longer matters, because survival quietly teaches the nervous system where disappointment is least likely. That night he lay awake thinking about all the invisible versions of her he had never met. The woman learning pottery, the woman sitting alone in coffee shops, the woman reading books on park benches, the woman taking walks after work, the woman slowly discovering that her own company felt safe. She had not become someone new overnight. She had become her. Without waiting for permission, he suddenly remembered an old conversation. Years earlier she had asked, "Do you think people keep growing after they fall in love?" He had laughed. "Hopefully." She smiled thoughtfully. "I think they have too. Otherwise eventually one person disappears." He hadn't understood what she meant. No. He wondered if she had been describing the future. The next morning something beautifully ordinary happened. They were making breakfast together. She reached for a pan. He reached for the same one. Their hands bumped. Both laughed. For a brief second, everything felt familiar again. Comfortable. Easy. Hope flickered inside him. Maybe this wasn't too late. Maybe they were finding each other again. Then she stepped back naturally. Continued cooking. The moment passed. It wasn't rejection. It was simply a moment. He realized he had attached enormous meaning to something that had lasted 3 seconds. Why? Because when we fear losing someone, every small sign begins to feel like evidence. Later that afternoon, he found himself looking through old photographs, vacations, birthdays, random selfies in grocery stores, messy kitchens, road trips. One picture caught his attention. She was laughing, not at the camera, at him. He couldn't even remember what he had said. He stared at the picture for a long time. Then he noticed something he had overlooked before. The way she was looking at him. Curious, completely present, as though he was still someone she was actively discovering. He whispered almost to himself, "When did you stop looking at me like that?" The answer came quietly. Perhaps. She stopped around the same time she realized he had stopped looking back. That thought hurt. Not because it blamed him, because it revealed something far more painful. Most emotional distance isn't created by one catastrophic mistake. It's created by thousands of unnoticed moments where two people slowly stop witnessing each other's becoming. Over the following weeks, he continued changing. Not to win her back. At least, not entirely. Something deeper had begun happening. He realized that emotional presence wasn't simply a relationship skill. It was a way of moving through life. Listening instead of assuming. Asking instead of concluding. Noticing instead of overlooking. Remaining curious even after years together. He had spent so long believing intimacy was something people achieved. Now he understood. Intimacy is something people practice, or slowly lose. One evening they sat outside watching the sunset. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The silence felt different now. Not empty. Not full. Simply honest. Finally he turned toward her. "I've been seeing things I never noticed before." She looked at him quietly. He continued, "I think, for a long time, I loved you while assuming I already knew you." She didn't interrupt. "I stopped asking who you were becoming." A long pause settled between them. Then she smiled. It wasn't the smile of someone whose heart had instantly healed. It wasn't the smile movies usually give us. It was softer than that. Sadder. Kinder. Almost grateful. She looked toward the horizon before speaking. "We've both changed." Only 4 words. Yet they carried years inside them. Not accusation. Not forgiveness. Just truth. And perhaps that was the beginning of something real. Because for the first time, he wasn't trying to return to the relationship they once had. He was finally meeting the woman she had become, while slowly becoming a different man himself. Whether that realization would arrive in time, neither of them knew. But perhaps love's greatest test is not whether the people once chose each other. It is whether they are willing, after years of invisible change, to become curious enough to choose each other all over again. There is a painful belief that quietly follows many people after a relationship begins to change. It sounds something like this: "If I finally understand now, surely that should count for something. It feels fair, reasonable, even. After all, growth is good. Awareness matters. Learning matters. So surely, if someone finally realizes what they did wrong, love should patiently wait for them to catch up. That life doesn't always move according to our realizations. Sometimes, our understanding arrives years after another person's hope has quietly run out. He struggled with that thought for weeks. Not because she had left. She hadn't. Not because she was angry. She wasn't. In some ways, that made everything even harder. If she had yelled, he would have known where the pain lived. If she had accused him, he would have known what to defend. If she had slammed doors, at least there would have been no's. Instead, there was kindness, gentleness, respect, and underneath all of it, a distance that could no longer be explained by a single bad week. One evening they were cleaning the house together. Music played softly from the kitchen. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual. She vacuumed the living room while he organized a bookshelf. At one point, he looked up. She was humming to herself, completely unaware he was watching. It struck him that she looked peaceful, not because everything between them had been repaired, because she had stopped tying every emotion to the condition of the relationship. Years ago, her mood rose and fell with his attention. If he seemed distant, she searched for ways to reconnect. If he looked sad, she worried. If conversations became shorter, she tried making them longer. Now, she still cared, but she no longer abandoned herself every time the relationship felt uncertain. That change was beautiful. It was also devastating, because he understood exactly how much pain had been required for her to arrive there. Healing often looks strange from the outside. People expect healing to make someone softer, more open, more romantic. Sometimes, healing makes someone quieter, more careful, more selective with where they place their emotional energy. Not because they have less love to give, because they have finally learned that love without reciprocity slowly becomes exhaustion. He remembered countless evenings when she had asked, "Can we talk?" At the time, those words had sounded heavy, demanding. He often sighed before sitting down, as though conversation itself were another task on an already busy day. Now, he found himself wishing she would ask again, just once, because now, he had answers. Now he could explain. Now he understood. But she rarely asked anymore, not because she no longer had questions, because she had already spent years asking them. There is a moment in many relationships that almost nobody notices while it is happening. It is the moment someone stops trying to be understood, not because they stop caring, because they become convinced that repeating themselves will not create listening. One rainy afternoon they found themselves trapped inside the house. The weather turned everything grey. Rain tapped softly against the windows. She curled up on one end of the couch with a novel. He sat at the other end pretending to read emails. Pretending, because he had reread the same sentence 6 times. His attention kept drifting toward her. He watched the way she occasionally smiled at something in her book, the way she tucked loose strands of hair behind her ear, the way she absent-mindedly rubbed the corner of the page before turning it. He suddenly realized he was studying her, not because she had become mysterious, because he had stopped paying attention for so long that ordinary things now felt unfamiliar. He quietly asked, "What are you reading?" She looked up. Oh. She held up the cover. It's about a woman who starts over in a small coastal town. Is it good? I like it. What do you like about it? She paused, thought for a moment. I think. She smiled faintly. I like stories where people slowly become themselves again. The room fell silent. He wasn't sure whether she had intended that sentence to mean more. Perhaps she hadn't. Perhaps the meaning only landed so heavily because of where he now stood emotionally. For years, he had believed relationships were maintained through loyalty, faithfulness, responsibility, providing. All of those things mattered. Of course they did. But now he saw another truth. Relationships are also maintained through ongoing discovery, through continuing to ask, "Who are you today?" instead of assuming yesterday's answer still applies. He thought back to the beginning. When they first met, every conversation had been filled with curiosity. Favorite books, childhood dreams, embarrassing stories, future plans, music, fear, hope. Everything fascinated them because everything was still unknown. Then, life settled. Careers, bills, laundry, appointments, vacations, responsibilities. Without realizing it, they stopped interviewing each other's hearts. They started managing each other's schedules instead. One night he found an old voice message she had sent years ago, completely by accident. His phone had backed up old conversations. He pressed play. Her younger voice filled the room. "I saw this little bakery today and thought of you. I know that's random. Anyway, I hope your meeting goes well. Call me when you're done." The message lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet he listened 3 times. Not because of what she said, because of how she sounded. There was excitement in her voice, a kind of effortless emotional reach. She expected connection. She assumed it would be welcomed. He wondered, when did she stop sending messages like that? Then another question followed. How many of them had I answered with, "I'm busy. Talk later"? The mind has an incredible ability to compress years into simple habits. We rarely notice the 1,000 tiny interactions shaping a relationship until we begin looking backward. Then suddenly, every rushed goodbye, every distracted response, every unfinished conversation, every delayed hug, every missed question, begins forming a pattern. Not one large wound, thousands of paper cuts. He wasn't drowning in guilt anymore. Something else had replaced it. Grief. Not grief for the relationship alone. Grief for all the versions of love that had quietly passed between them unnoticed. The jokes he barely looked up from his phone to hear. The invitations she stopped extending. The fears she eventually learned to carry alone. The celebrations she quietly made smaller because he seemed too tired. The dreams she shared only once, never twice. Grief is strange. It doesn't only mourn what ended. Sometimes, it mourns what could have existed. A few days later they visited his parents. His mother hugged them both warmly. As they prepared lunch together, his mother smiled at her and said, "You always take such good care of him." She smiled politely. "Oh, we take care of each other." Such a simple answer. Most people in the room probably accepted it without another thought. He didn't, because he knew she had intentionally changed one word. Years ago, she might have said, "I try." Now, she described a relationship she hoped existed, not necessarily the one she had experienced. Driving home, he couldn't stop thinking about that sentence. "We take care of each other," he asked himself honestly. Had that been true? Sometimes, yes, but not consistently. Too often, she had taken care of both of them emotionally, while he assumed his practical reliability automatically balanced the scales. Love is rarely measured that way. Human hearts do not calculate fairness like accountants. They remember how often they felt emotionally alone. One evening, after dinner, they sat on opposite ends of the porch watching fireflies appear across the yard. The air was warm. Neither rushed to speak. Finally, he broke the silence. "I've been thinking about something." She nodded. "What?" "I don't think I ever thanked you." He stopped. Not because he didn't know what to say, because suddenly there were too many things. "Thank you for believing in me, for remembering everything, for asking questions, for staying patient, for trying, for waiting, for loving me in ways I didn't recognize until years later." How do you fit years into one sentence? You can't. So he simply whispered, "For everything." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled. A quiet smile. One touched by tenderness and sadness. "You're welcome." That was all. No dramatic reconciliation. No tears. No embrace. Just two words. Yet something about them almost broke him. Because gratitude, while beautiful, is not the same thing as repair. Many people confuse realization with restoration. They believe that once someone finally understands, everything naturally returns. But understanding cannot travel backward through time. It cannot comfort the version of someone who cried alone 3 years ago. It cannot answer the messages never sent. It cannot replace birthdays spent feeling invisible. It cannot return conversations that never happened. Awareness changes the future. It does not rewrite the past. That truth is painful. It is also strangely freeing. Because once he accepted it, he stopped trying to erase history. Instead, he focused on becoming someone who would no longer create the same history again. Not because it guaranteed she would stay, because it was the only honest way to love another human being, without expecting transformation to earn immediate forgiveness, without believing growth automatically deserves another chance. Real growth asks for nothing. It simply becomes different. Weeks later, they were walking home after dinner. The sidewalks glowed under the soft amber light of street lamps. She slipped her hands into her jacket pockets. He walked beside her quietly. Neither hurried. Neither reached for certainty. Somewhere ahead, a couple laughed while crossing the street. A child chased bubbles floating through the evening air. Life continued around them. Simple. Unaware. He looked up at the night sky and realized something that would stay with him forever. Love is not only about whether someone still loves you. Sometimes, the deeper question is whether the version of you they once needed finally arrived after they had already learned how to live without him. And perhaps, that is the hardest truth any heart can carry. Not that love disappeared. Not that affection vanished. But that time kept moving. People kept growing. And while one heart was finally learning how to speak the language of emotional presence, the other had quietly become fluent in surviving without ever needing to hear it again. There is a moment that eventually arrives after enough reflection. It comes after the guilt, after the endless replaying of memories, after wondering what should have been said, after imagining different endings. It is quieter than regret, softer than heartbreak, and strangely, it asks a completely different question. Not, can I still save this? But, who do I become now? For a long time, he believed every change he made needed to produce a result. If he became more attentive, surely she would notice. If he became more emotionally open, surely the distance would disappear. If he learned how to listen, surely everything they had lost could somehow return. There was still a hidden negotiation happening inside him, a quiet bargain with life. I will change, if changing gives me back what I lost. It sounded noble, but beneath it, there was still fear, still attachment, still the hope that growth could function like a key, unlocking a door that had slowly closed. Then one afternoon, something unexpected happened. He was walking through a bookstore alone. It had become one of his new habits. Not because he loved books more than before, because he had discovered that quiet places forced him to hear thoughts he used to drown out with noise. He wandered without purpose, running his fingers along rows of unfamiliar titles, watching strangers sit in corners reading without urgency. There was a peacefulness in the room that felt almost sacred. No one was trying to impress anyone. No one was rushing. People simply were. Near the back of the store, he noticed an elderly couple. The woman struggled to reach a book on the highest shelf. Without saying a word, the man stood, reached up, handed it to her. She smiled. He smiled back. Neither thanked the other. Neither turned the moment into something dramatic. Then they returned to browsing, The entire interaction lasted less than 10 seconds. Yet something about it stayed with him. Not because it was romantic, because it was attentive. The man hadn't waited for her to ask. He had simply noticed. He stood there longer than necessary, wondering how many thousands of moments like that had quietly built their relationship over decades. Tiny acts, almost invisible, impossible to photograph, too ordinary to become stories. Yet somehow, those ordinary moments become the architecture of love. Not anniversaries, not vacations, not expensive gifts. Attention, repeated consistently over time. As he left the bookstore, he realized something that felt almost embarrassingly simple. He had spent years believing love was proven during extraordinary moments, crises, celebrations, milestones. But most relationships are not lived inside extraordinary moments. They are lived on Tuesday mornings, at grocery stores, in parked cars, while folding laundry, while deciding what to cook for dinner, while asking, "How did your meeting go?" then remembering the answer 2 days later. Real intimacy is built in places that rarely feel important while you're living them. That evening, he arrived home before she did. Instead of reaching for his phone, he opened the windows, watered the plants, folded the blanket left on the couch, prepared vegetables for dinner. Not because he expected praise, not because he wanted her to notice, simply because these things needed doing. When she came home, she smiled. "The house feels nice." He smiled back. "It does." Neither mentioned who had done what. For the first time, he understood that love does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply makes another person's day slightly lighter. He found himself becoming slower. Not physically, emotionally. He stopped interrupting conversations with solutions. Stopped assuming he already knew what someone meant before they finished speaking. Stopped filling silence simply because silence felt uncomfortable. He became curious again. Not only with her, with everyone. The cashier whose smile looked tired. His father, who rarely spoke about feelings. A co-worker who always said, "I'm fine," a little too quickly. He realized, people reveal themselves in tiny fragments. If someone is willing to notice. One afternoon his sister called. Normally their conversations lasted 5 minutes. Family updates, weather, work, goodbye. This time, after she mentioned feeling exhausted, he asked, "What kind of exhausted?" There was a pause, longer than expected. Then she quietly said, "Honestly, I don't think anyone has asked me that in months." They talked for almost an hour. After hanging up, he sat in silence. Such a small question. Yet it had opened a completely different conversation. He wondered how many relationships quietly change, simply because someone begins asking better questions. He often thought about something she had once said. It doesn't have to be much. At first, he believed she meant breakfast. Now, he understood she had been describing love itself. Love rarely asks for perfection. It asks for participation, presence, attention, the willingness to remain emotionally awake inside ordinary life. Weeks passed. Something inside the house felt different. Not dramatically. The walls hadn't changed. The furniture remained the same. The routine still existed. But the atmosphere had shifted. There were longer conversations. More eye contact. Less rushing. More laughter that wasn't forced. Sometimes, nothing was even being solved. And somehow, those became the conversations he remembered most. One Sunday afternoon, they cleaned out the garage together. Boxes filled with forgotten belongings surrounded them. Old photographs, broken lamps, travel souvenirs, receipts from years ago. At the bottom of one dusty box, she found an old notebook. She laughed softly. I completely forgot about this. What is it? My journal from when we first started dating. She smiled while flipping through a few pages, then stopped. I forgot how much I used to write. He asked gently. What did you write about? She looked at one page for a long moment, then closed the notebook. A lot of hope. Her voice wasn't bitter, only thoughtful, as if she were remembering another version of herself. He nodded. I hope you still have hope. She looked at him quietly. I do. A pause. It's just different now. He understood exactly what she meant. Hope changes as people change. Young hope often expects. Mature hope simply remains open, without demanding certainty. Later that evening, he found himself thinking less about fixing the relationship and more about honoring it. There is a difference. Trying to fix something often comes from fear. Trying to honor something comes from gratitude. Fear asks, how do I keep this? Gratitude asks, how do I care for what still exists? That distinction changed everything. He stopped measuring progress, stopped looking for signs, stopped interpreting every smile, every touch, every conversation as evidence that things were getting better. Instead, he simply tried to become someone whose presence created peace. Not because peace guaranteed love, because peace is a gift in itself. One evening they were sitting outside after dinner. The neighborhood was unusually quiet. Children's bicycles lay scattered across driveways. A sprinkler clicked rhythmically across someone's lawn. Birds settled into the trees. She suddenly asked, can I ask you something? Of course. She looked toward the fading sky. What changed? He took his time answering. Because the old version of him would have said, I realized I was wrong. Or, I didn't want to lose you. Those things were true, but they weren't complete. Finally, he spoke. I stopped thinking about how you made me feel. She looked at him. He continued. I started wondering how I made you feel. Silence. Gentle. Unhurried. I think, he said quietly. I spent years asking whether I felt loved. Another pause. I almost never asked whether you felt loved by me. She didn't answer immediately. She simply looked at him. There were tears in her eyes. Not dramatic tears. Not tears demanding comfort. Just quiet emotion. The kind that arrives when someone finally hears words they stopped expecting. She reached over, placed her hand on top of his. Not tightly, not possessively. Just there. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't certainty. It was presence. And for now, presence was enough. Life continued, as life always does. There were still disagreements, still stressful days, still moments when one of them became distracted. Neither had become perfect, because perfection had never been the goal. Awareness was. Returning was. Choosing again was. Months later, he caught himself doing something that made him smile. She had been unusually quiet during breakfast. Instead of assuming she was simply tired, he asked, you seem somewhere else today. She looked surprised. I do. A little. She smiled. I've just been thinking about my dad. He nodded. Do you want to talk about it? She did. For nearly 40 minutes. Not because there was a problem to solve. Because someone had noticed before she needed to explain. Walking into work that morning, he realized he hadn't asked the question because he was trying to repair the past. He had asked because it had become who he was. And perhaps, that was the deepest transformation of all. Real change no longer performs itself. It becomes instinct. Looking back, he finally understood why some people spend years haunted by love that slipped quietly through their fingers. It isn't because they never loved deeply. Often, they did. It isn't because they were cruel. Many weren't. It is because love can exist, while attention slowly disappears. Affection can remain. while curiosity quietly fades. Commitment can survive, while emotional presence slowly falls asleep. And by the time awareness finally returns, another heart may have already learned how to stop waiting. If there is one truth that remains after every memory, every regret, every realization, perhaps it is this: love is never only about finding the right person. It is about continuing to notice them, again, and again, and again, long after the mystery of the beginning has faded, long after ordinary life has replaced excitement, long after routines have settled into the spaces where butterflies once lived. Because people never stop changing. The person you fell in love with years ago does not exist anymore. Neither do you. Every morning, the relationship quietly asks the same question. Will you meet this new version of each other with the same curiosity you once had as strangers? Some people answer that question too late. Some answer it just in time. But the ones who build the deepest kind of love are rarely the ones who never drift apart. They are the ones who never stop returning, not only to each other, but to the quiet, ordinary practice of truly seeing the person standing right in front of them. Years later, if someone asked him what changed his life, he would not mention a single conversation. Not the night they stayed up talking, not the afternoon they held hands on the porch, not even the day he finally understood what emotional presence truly meant. Because life had taught him something unexpected. The moments that transform us rarely announce themselves. Instead, they hide inside ordinary Tuesdays, inside grocery stores, inside unfinished cups of coffee, inside the quiet rituals that seem too small to remember. Until one day they become everything. Time had continued moving, as it always does. The seasons changed without asking anyone's permission. The maple tree outside their window lost its leaves, grew them back, lost them again. Neighbors moved away. New families arrived. Restaurants opened, closed. Children on bicycles became teenagers driving cars. Life never paused long enough for anyone to completely understand it. It simply kept inviting people to pay attention. He had become someone who noticed. Not perfectly. He still forgot things. Still became distracted. Still had stressful days when work followed him home. But something fundamental had shifted. Whenever he caught himself drifting, he returned. Again and again. Not because someone reminded him. Because he had learned that relationships are not protected by promises. They are protected by returns. Returning to curiosity, returning to kindness, returning to the habit of seeing. One autumn morning, they decided to visit the small cafe where they had gone on one of their earliest dates. The place had barely changed. The wooden floors still creaked. The owner still greeted customers as though they were neighbors. The same window overlooked the quiet street. They chose the corner table without discussing it, almost instinctively. Years ago, they had spent hours there talking about impossible dreams, places they wanted to travel, books they planned to read, the kind of people they hoped to become. Now, they sat in the same seats, older, quieter, less certain about life, strangely more peaceful. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. He smiled. "You still do that?" "What?" "Hold your coffee like you're trying to warm your whole day." She laughed. "I've always done that." "I know." A pause. "I just never noticed." She looked at him for a long moment, then smiled in that quiet way he had come to treasure. Not because the observation was extraordinary, because it meant something much deeper. Someone was paying attention. There is a beautiful truth hidden inside long relationships. The longer we know someone, the easier it becomes to stop looking. We assume we already know their smile, already know their habits, already know every story they could possibly tell. But no human being remains the same. Even the way someone holds a coffee cup contains years inside it. Hands become older. Movements become gentler. Silences become more meaningful. People change so gradually that only attentive love notices. After breakfast, they walked through a nearby park. Leaves covered the path in shades of amber and gold. Children chased each other between trees. A dog stubbornly refused to leave a pile of fallen leaves. Somewhere in the distance, someone laughed so freely that strangers smiled without knowing why. Life, in all its ordinary beauty, continued. She stopped walking, bent down, picked up a small maple leaf. "This one's perfect." He looked at it. To anyone else, it was simply another leaf, slightly faded, no larger than the palm of a hand. But she admired it as though it was something precious. He smiled. "You've always collected little things." "I have. Leaves, smooth stones, movie tickets, pressed flowers, receipts from places you liked." She laughed. "I forgot about that." "I didn't." And in that moment, he realized something. He had not only learned to notice her, he had learned to remember her. There is a difference. Noticing happens in the present. Remembering is noticing that survives time. Months earlier, he would never have remembered the little collections she kept. Now, those tiny details felt like pieces of her language. Ways she quietly moved through the world, looking for beauty others walked past. He wondered how many people spend their entire lives loving someone, without ever learning the language that person naturally speaks. That evening, they returned home carrying nothing except the little leaf she had slipped inside her notebook. She placed it carefully between two pages. He watched her. "What?" she asked, smiling. "Nothing. You've got that look." "What look?" "The one where you're thinking too much." He laughed. "I was just wondering." She waited. How many beautiful things almost disappear simply because nobody stops long enough to notice them? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for his hand. Sometimes, understanding doesn't need words. Winter arrived quietly. The mornings became colder. The windows fogged with warm breath. They found themselves spending more evenings indoors, reading, cooking, listening to music. Some nights, they barely spoke. And yet, the silence no longer frightened him, because silence itself had changed. Years ago, their silence had been filled with assumptions. Now, it was filled with awareness. There is an enormous difference between two people saying nothing because they have stopped reaching, and to people saying nothing because they no longer need to prove they are present. Presence has its own sound. Sometimes, it sounds exactly like silence. One snowy afternoon, the electricity briefly went out. The house fell completely quiet. No television, no internet, no humming appliances. Only the wind tapping gently against the windows. She lit a few candles. He found an old deck of cards. They spent hours playing games they had not played since their 20s. They laughed over forgotten rules, argued playfully about who was cheating, made tea on the gas stove. At one point, she looked around the candlelit room and smiled. "I forgot how little we actually need." He nodded. So did I. How much of life had they spent believing happiness required bigger things? More money, better timing, perfect circumstances. Yet here they were. Candles, tea, cards, conversation. And somehow, it felt complete. As spring returned, he noticed another change. Not in her, in himself. He no longer felt the constant fear of losing everything. Not because life offered guarantees, because fear was no longer the reason he loved. Fear clings. Love attends. Fear watches for signs of leaving. Love notices signs of living. The difference transformed the way he experienced every ordinary day. One morning she left early for work. As she walked toward the door, he called after her. "Wait." She turned. He walked over. adjusted the collar of her coat, smoothed a strand of hair caught beneath the fabric. There, she smiled. Thank you. The door closed behind her. He stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then he laughed softly to himself. Years earlier, she had done exactly the same thing for him countless times. Straightening his tie, brushing lint from his jacket, handing him forgotten keys, making sure he had eaten before leaving. At the time, he had barely noticed. Now, his hands instinctively repeated the same gesture, not because he had remembered the action, because somewhere along the way, he had finally understood the love behind it. Late that evening, he found himself standing at the kitchen sink washing dishes. Warm water, soap bubbles, the familiar rhythm of ordinary life. She walked in. Without saying anything, she dried each plate as he washed it. Neither had asked the other for help. They simply fell into the rhythm together. Wash, dry, stack, repeat. Halfway through, he smiled. What? She asked. I used to think love had to feel exciting all the time. She laughed softly. And now, he looked around the kitchen. The dishes, the warm lights, the quiet music playing from another room. Her standing beside him. I think love feels more like this. She looked at the sink. Washing dishes. He laughed. No. She waited, being somewhere I'd rather not be. With someone who somehow makes it feel like exactly where I want to be. Her eyes softened. No dramatic speech followed. No cinematic kiss. Just another plate. Another towel. Another quiet evening. And somehow, that made it even more beautiful. Years later, if someone had asked him what love ultimately became, he would not describe passion. Although passion mattered, he would not describe sacrifice. Although sacrifice mattered too, he would not even describe happiness. Because happiness comes and goes. Instead, he would say this: love became attention. The kind of attention that remembers how someone takes their tea. The kind that notices when their smile is slightly quieter than usual. The kind that asks one more question instead of assuming. The kind that reaches for another hand without needing a reason. The kind that says, I see you, without speaking a single word. Perhaps that is why the greatest regrets in love are so rarely about the spectacular moments. People seldom lie awake remembering expensive vacations, perfect anniversaries, grand declarations. Instead, they remember the coffee that grew cold while someone waited to be heard, the text they never answered, the hug they hurried through, the story they forgot to ask about, the tired eyes they failed to notice, the ordinary evening that looked exactly like every other evening, until it quietly became the last one before everything changed. And perhaps, that is also where hope lives. Not inside extraordinary promises, but inside tomorrow morning, when someone wakes up beside another human being, looks at them as though meeting them for the first time, and chooses, once again, to notice. Because in the end, the deepest love is rarely built by people who never make mistakes. It is built by those who never stop learning that the smallest moments, the forgotten coffee, the straightened collar, the extra question, the quiet pause before offering advice, the hand reached for without thinking, the simple words, how are you, really, were never small at all. They were the story. They had always been the story. And perhaps, they always will be.